Good afternoon, everybody. It's time to start the next session. My name is Carter Burns. I'm the Executive Director of the Historic Natchez Foundation, and it's my honor to introduce our next speaker. So Jim Miller spent more than 4 decades in the sports world as both a journalist and executive before returning to writing full-time. The Kentucky native began his writing career in 1970 as a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal, and then moved to the Baltimore Evening Sun, where he covered the Baltimore Colts and the National Football League. Jim left the newspaper business in 1981 for the NFL, where he began a 21-year career that took him to the New Orleans Saints in 1986, and to subsequent positions with the Buffalo Bills and Chicago Bears. He returned to New Orleans in 2003 to become the athletic director at the University of New Orleans, guiding the UNO program through the ravages of Hurricane Katrina and its aftermath. Jim retired from UNO in January 2010 to write about UNO's Katrina ordeal in his 2012 book, Where the Water Kept Rising. Miller's 2017 book, Integrated, the Lincoln Institute, Basketball, and a Vanished Tradition, reveals the challenges faced by one African-American high school in the early years of integration. Miller's most recent book, King of the Gunrunners, published in 2024 by the University Press of Mississippi, is the untold story of a forgotten American whose efforts to end the 400 years of Spanish rule in Cuba inspired a revolution and helped pave the way for the United States' emergence as a global power. Jim and his wife Jean live on the Mississippi Gulf Coast in Diamond Head, Mississippi.
I appreciate it, Carter. Thank you. You read it just as I wrote it. After seeing that bio, you think this guy can't hold a job. A very nice lady in the back asked me, "Are you a history professor?" I said, "No, ma'am. I'm a reformed sports writer." But in any case, if you're a writer and you're a history aficionado, it's not hard to find good stories. And just one thing, talking very briefly about the craft before I get into the book itself. You know, there's a lot of different ways to research history. One of the earlier books I researched, I spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours in libraries, in the National Archives, in places where you just pull down the proper documents and you just sit there and take what you want. The other type of research is one actually that I'm doing on my next book. It's a memory of a remembrance of a very prominent man in athletics, and practically every piece of information with regard to this gentleman has to come from interviews. So I'm sitting here having to interview about 50 people on this one person, when I'd really probably rather just sit in the library with a stack of books and research documents and all that stuff. But in any case, we're talking about a guy named John D. Hart today. John Hart was a Baltimore fruit importer. His father owned a wholesale fruit business, and it was John's duty and his what he had to do was to pilot the boats from Baltimore to the West Indies, pick up bananas, pineapples, coconuts, and bring them back to Baltimore to sell. That was, believe it or not, that was a period when one fruit in particular was head and shoulders above all others, and that was the banana. The banana had really just been discovered as a business commodity in the 1870s and 80s, and it really didn't take off as a big sale item until people, consumers, were taught that you have to peel it before you eat it. And once they learned that, the banana industry took off. And John Hart was again, he didn't like so much the sale of the bananas. He liked the trip. He liked to brave the ocean and go into the West Indies and bargain for bananas and coconuts and pineapple And that's what he really liked. It was a thriving business until John Hart's father died suddenly, and at 24 years old, John is the head of the John D. Hart, or the James Hart Company. He worked in Baltimore for a while. He continued to build the business, but he said he was very ambitious. He said, "Hey, look, there's got to be other places we can do this," and so he moved his operation to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia at the time was the third largest city in America, over 1 million people, more mouths to feed, more bananas to be sold. And so Hart, in around 1888, 89, he moved to Philadelphia, and in a very short time, he was the most successful, most aggressive fruit importer on the eastern seaboard. Things were going great for him until 1893. And you historians will know what happened in 1893. It was the panic of 1893. It was probably the worst economic depression in the United States history until the Great Depression of the 30s. Banks were closing, railroads were shutting down, people were out of work, and when you're out of work, you can't afford luxuries like ripe bananas. And so Hart's business was slowly sliding downhill. He tried to make ends meet over a 2-year period, and in 1895 he was about to give it up when he gets a knock on the door. And his office is on Pier 11 on the Delaware River. His office on Pier 11, he gets the knock on the door, and he opens the door, and it's a man dressed in black, hair slicked back. Today you would have thought it was Johnny Cash. It wasn't. It was a Cuban named Emilio Nunez. Emilio Nunez was representing the Cuban Revolutionary Party, which tried to launch another revolution in 1895 to kick the Spanish out of Cuba. There had been many revolutions between the Cuban rebels and Spain in the early 1800s. In the mid-1800s, there was a 10-year war, 1868 to 1878, and the Spanish were undefeated during all these revolutions. After the 1878 war, so many Cuban people just gave up. Spain is going to rule us forever, so they immigrated to the United States. So a huge influx of Cubans came to the United States, mainly started out in Florida, but it's really spread all over. In fact, every pocket of Cuban refugees formed clubs. And so there were about 30 to 32 Cuban clubs that were thriving. They brought the cigar business here, they got into other businesses, but the idea of revolution was not over. There was a new bright light in the New York office of the Cuban Revolutionary Party, and his name was Jose Marti. Jose Marti was a speaker, a writer, and he was a man who was convinced that we can pull together and we can kick the Spanish out of Cuba. Well, the number one thing that they didn't have, and the reason they had not been very successful, was because of weaponry. The Spanish were very, very sharp in the sense that they would not allow weapons to be manufactured in Cuba. They didn't want the rebels knocking over the armory and stealing the guns and ammunition. So the only guns and ammunition up to this point that the Cuban rebels had were when they did a machete charge, which was supposed to be a terrifying thing. They'd come out of the jungle waving their machetes, and if the Spaniards weren't prepared for it, they'd throw down their weapons and run. So now you had some weapons, but that wasn't enough, obviously. So Marti and his other executives at the Cuban Revolutionary Party in New York decided that we've got to have a situation where we've got to have guns and ammunition and armaments and supplies shipped to Cuba. We've got to hire somebody, some people in the United States with boats who would be willing to help us out. And so Nunez was, that's what he was doing. He was the director of expeditions for the Cuban Revolutionary Party. And he knocked on Hart's door and said, "Mr. Hart, I hear you have boats and no cargo. I have cargo and no boats. And so if you don't mind the cargo you're carrying, would you carry ammunitions and guns to Cuba so that we can defeat the Spanish?" And Hart was desperate. He couldn't make ends meet with the current economy, the climate of the economy. So he signed a contract. He shook hands with Nunez, and for $10,000 per successful expedition, he thought he was going to get back on his feet financially. And he did, believe it or not. Over a 2-year period, Hart became the king of the Gunrunners. He was the most feared captain and pilot and charter master on the Atlantic seaboard. And some other people took notice of his success. The Cuban party in New York, they were pretty cagey. What they did was they got hold of the local newspapers. This was the time of the yellow press. And who knows what the yellow press is? The yellow press in New York was a very, very aggressive competition between publishers like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer and James Gordon Bennett to see who could have the most sensational stories on a daily basis to entice readers. And the PR guy, if you will, for the Revolutionary Party had a 4 o'clock briefing for the New York press every day. And he called it the Peanut Club because he would have a big bowl of peanuts, and knowing that writers are somewhat lazy and always hungry, they came in and they'd grab handfuls of peanuts, and facts were optional. You know, you got all the peanuts you can have, but facts are optional. But here's what happened today. And there was a lot of propaganda going on. The papers ate it up. John D. Hart became an American hero. The public, the reading public, was just enamored by Hart. In fact, they would actually publish when Hart's boats were coming up the Delaware River to Philadelphia, and crowds would be out there greeting the boat, and they would treat the boats like the Constellation or the Constitution, patriotic boats that are not unlike what we went through 100 years ago in the United States, the fight for freedom. So the yellow press was behind Hart all the way. Well, the United States government had changed hands in 1896. The Cleveland administration was out. The McKinley administration came in. The Cleveland administration was kind of a laissez-faire, lackadaisical attitude toward the Cubans, toward the Spanish. Didn't care too much about helping either side because they were trying to stay out of it. But the McKinley administration, they took more of a proactive approach. One thing they did was they did try to appease Spain in the sense that they put more Navy ships, more revenue cutters, which was the precursor of the Coast Guard, and they put those in the bordering the ports, so that any boat that would come out, any of Hart's ships that would come out with ammunition or that they had a suspicion that they were on an expedition, the revenue cutters would try to stop the boats and arrest Hart. Well, they got a lot of help from the Spanish ambassador in Washington. Of course, he didn't want Hart to supply the rebels with ammunition. And actually, the American government didn't want Hart to supply the rebels because he was violating the American neutrality laws. And the neutrality laws just stated that any American who is helping the enemy of a friend is subject to arrest. And of course, the United States and Spain were not friends, but not bosom buddies, but they weren't at war yet. So Hart was really trying to run his expeditions to Cuba, and he was quite successful. But finally, Hart in 1897, Hart was arrested, and he was he was hauled into court. In the past, because of the difficulty in finding a jury that would convict him, or a judge that was against the Cuban Revolution, Hart was always exonerated, or never could find a jury to convict him. But in 1897, there was a U.S. District Court judge named William Butler, and Butler was basically, if you listen to the old West analogies, he was the hanging judge when it came to the trying to catch the rebels and Hart and the expeditions. Hart's arrest, he was arrested, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Well, in the meantime, McKinley is really trying to stop the revolution. He hears that the rebels are making progress. They're being armed by Hart and the other people that are working with him, and McKinley also hears that there are atrocities going on in Cuba. The Spanish governor, his name was Valerio Weyler, and he had formed several concentration camps around Cuba to put the civilians in the concentration camps, because the civilians were helping the rebels, and it even got to the point where, I don't want to offend anybody, but even the prostitutes who serviced the Spanish soldiers and officers, they would charge cartridges instead of money to the soldiers, so that they'd turn all the cartridges and ammunition over to the rebels. So that was an interesting chapter, by the way. So you really should. I'll tell you about it if you buy the book. Anyway, the Spanish. McKinley also said to the Spanish ambassador, he said, "Look," he said, "I'll tell you what. I want to show the Spanish people that we're supporting your efforts to rein in the Cubans, and what we're going to do is we're going to give you a gesture of friendship from the American people." And McKinley's idea of a gesture of friendship was to send 2 battleships, American battleships, into Cuba, one being the Montgomery, which was a cruiser, sending that to Santiago, and the other they sent into Havana Harbor. And every school child knows the name of that boat, and that boat was the Maine. Remember the Maine? A short time after the Maine arrived in Cuba, ostensibly as a gesture of friendship, the Maine exploded, and 263 American officers and men died. And of course, with the newspapers all revved up against Spain anyway, they just demanded war. American people who had been hearing all this anti-Spain, pro-Cuba rhetoric over the last couple of years, they talked to their congressmen, they contacted Capitol Hill, and they said, you've got to declare war. And basically, that's what was in the mix until that was February 15th was the day the Maine exploded. 8 days later, John D. Hart went to prison. Well, this is kind of after the fact. John D. Hart's wife was named Kate Hart. She's an interesting story too, but Kate went to McKinley, got an audience, and said, look, this is what my husband was fighting for. So you need to give him a presidential pardon. And McKinley said, look, I've got a war plan. You're right, I'll pardon him, but not yet. Just give me some time. Well, it took him about 4 months to decide, and in those 4 months, the Congress voted to intervene. The first American soldiers, oddly enough, were sent to Cuba on vessels with Hart's captains because they knew the way, they knew the road, and so the American troops started assembling in I think Santiago in the eastern part. That was the first onslaught of American soldiers. Teddy Roosevelt quit as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he formed his own band of cavalry and the Rough Riders. And so, it was a kind of a sexy time for Roosevelt and young Americans who they'd been hearing about war from their uncles and their fathers, and they didn't have anything to show their manhood. So now the Spanish-American War was a godsend for these people. There was a couple of fraternity brothers at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore who hitched a ride on one of Hart's vessels going to Cuba. And oddly enough, not oddly, it's naively enough, they still wore their fraternity pins. I don't know what fraternity they were in, but they wore their fraternity pins when the boats dropped them off, and they were supposed to make contact with a Cuban unit, which they did, but it was really the wrong Cuban unit. The Cuban rebels were really divided 50-50. There was the black rebels led by Antonio Maceo and his brother Jose, and then there was the white units, and so they were in different parts of the country. But the Baltimore boys met the black unit, and the general said to them, he said, a white guy in this part of Cuba, you've either got to be really stupid or a spy. And so, and by the way, I like those fraternity pins. So the general took the fraternity pins, but anyway, they straightened out. They got to the right units. But after the intervention on April 20th, McKinley took more of an attention to John D. Hart. William Randolph Hearst had a front page story, several of them, that said Captain Hart needs to be pardoned. And Kate Hart went back to McKinley, and he finally pardoned John D. Hart. Why is this important? Why is John D. Hart important? Well, Hart supplied the Cuban rebels to the point where to the flashpoint. They couldn't really survive without having proper ammunition, proper artillery, proper amount of weapons. And so they fought the Spanish basically to a draw until there was a flashpoint. The flashpoint could have been, well, the Spanish would give up and go home, and there was some indication of that. But obviously the big flashpoint was when the Maine exploded, and everybody thought that Spain was guilty. The treaty that William McKinley signed with Spain, that was the one that really made the United States a global power instead of just a very insular power. The Spanish had to give up the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and in that period of time, the United States annexed Hawaii. So now the United States is looking at more trading posts, their trading areas, a new naval power. It spreads now all the way to the Philippine Islands, and also they're extending the Christian mission. The mindset in those days was that if you're west of Los Angeles, you're a heathen. Well, so now you can educate these people, but that was the mindset. But anyway, the idea that of the nation of America as a global power really started with John D. Hart's efforts and President McKinley's treaty. I want to read you an excerpt from the book, and it'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. And my writing is a lot more eloquent than my babbling up here, so hopefully you'll like this. 40 young Cubans fidgeted in the darkness of the tugboat's hold, cursing the order to put out their beloved cigarettes. It was near midnight on February 25, 1896, and the tug bounced across the choppy water of New York Harbor toward a rendezvous off Liberty Island. They dared not invite discovery, for the Spanish minister in Washington had spies in every American port and the backing of the U.S. government. The travelers breathed easier as the tug slowed and came alongside the tramp steamer Bermuda, whose engines were in motion, a sweet sound to the Cubans who knew the Bermuda soon would deliver them to the revolution in their homeland. Suddenly, a crewman on deck shouted a warning. A U.S. revenue cutter full of federal agents and Pinkerton detectives was bearing down and was soon upon them. The government boat struck the tug amidships, and the reverberation was enough to bring the towboat to a standstill. When the federal boat turned and headed for the steamer, the tug made a wild dash for the foot of Manhattan. The cutter glided near the Bermuda's portside companion ladder, and U.S. Marshal John McCarthy grabbed hold and swung onto the rungs, followed by a horde of badges and brass buttons, tumbling over one another onto the deck, raising their shields in one hand and revolvers in the other. The Cubans on board quickly surrendered, but in the commotion, few noticed the tugboat returning to the scene with a new player in this maritime drama. A tall, stocky man with a thick mustache and wearing a black bowler stood defiantly at the tug's bow like a carved figurehead. His name was John D. Hart, the most notorious target of two nations that, for different reasons, wanted to put him away for good. Hart leaped from the tug's railing to the Bermuda's ladder and climbed onto the deck, loudly demanding that the officers explain their actions. The federal marshals told Hart that his ship was being seized by the United States government and warned him not to interfere or he would be arrested. "To hell with the United States Marshals and their gang," Hart yelled defiantly, turning to the bewildered Cubans. "Come on, get up this anchor and let us get out to sea." Hart raised clenched fists to confirm his command as a half-dozen marshals rushed toward him, only to be scattered like a swarm of mosquitoes. Hart ran across the deck trying to rally his men while ignoring the pursuing authorities. The agents, though bloodied for their efforts, finally subdued Hart and pinned him to the deck. Struggling and trying to break free, Hart sputtered his objections to no avail. He was bound and caged in a makeshift brig below until he could be transported to the federal lockup at the foot of Manhattan. His antagonist out of the way, Marshal McCarthy went to work disabling the Bermuda as Hart sat below, seething at the federal officer's disrespect of an American citizen. The government would win this battle, but its hold on the flamboyant chartermaster would be brief. John D. Hart was the most visible of a disparate group of mariners between New York and Key West who for nearly 3 years tormented Spanish authorities, frustrated the U.S. government, and were hailed as heroes by an oppressed people trying to be free. Let's talk about our craft just a bit. I did briefly, but I've had a lot of questions. Where did you find this guy? I mean, he's not in the history books or anything. Well, John D. Hart's not in history books because after the war was ended and McKinley signed the peace treaty, Hart tried to get into the fruit business again. But his timing was terrible because at that time there was another conglomerate that was forming up in the Northeast, the Boston Fruit Company. Their founders bought 21 smaller importers, including John D. Hart, and that was the foundation of United Fruit, which a lot of you know, United Fruit Company. The Great White Fleet is still the mammoth. I had written a novel based on the same time period, and it was obviously a fiction. It was a fiction about a young man, 15 years old. His father was a tradesman. He wanted to be a newspaper writer, but his father, who was a union printer at one of the Baltimore papers, said, "You know, I see these drunken reporters all day long, and you don't want to be in that group." Well, anyway, the story went on, and I really thought it was pretty good. It was in the top 5 of the William Faulkner competition in New Orleans several years ago. An agent saw it, really liked it, and so we signed a contract. So you know, you got a book you're proud of, and you just signed with a big-time New York agent. Now, I mean, where do you go from there? Well, I thought maybe the sequel. So where did I take a young boy, 15 years old, in 1894? Well, you take him to the Spanish-American War. So I started researching the Spanish-American War, old newspapers mainly, and I kept seeing this name pop up. This Captain Hart has sent another successful expedition to Cuba. And Captain Hart and his heroic boat, the Loretta, which was named after Hart's 2 daughters, Laura and Ada. And the Loretta is coming to port tomorrow in Philadelphia. And I kept seeing this, and I'd never heard of this guy. And so the more research I did, really the more pieces kind of came together. And so I abandoned the hopes of a sequel to my novel, which was a good thing because even today, that's probably the most well-researched book or doorstop in my house. But, in any case, but that's again, it's kind of our craft. If you're looking for ideas, you know, you have to be patient because ideas will find you. If you're writing, if you've written anything, if you're trying to write, the ideas will find you, but you just have to keep looking. Don't stop. Just keep looking. So that's my spiel. I'd love to open it up to a Q&A.
All right, I'll give him a round of applause. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, questions.
As another reformed sports writer turned historian.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, except that I'm sure you're glad you're out of the newspaper business
Oh, yeah.
now.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Because we all would have been anyway.
Yeah.
But I was what reminded me, you talked about William Morris during the Revolution, who ran a fleet of his merchant ships as privateers stealing from the British. And he remarked that patriotism and profit can always go hand in hand. And I was wondering if this guy was was it more about profit, or did he become enthusiastic and patriotic toward the Cuban rebels?
That's a very good question, and that's one I usually get, and I'm waiting for the question, so thank you. But I think when he started out, he was so desperate financially with the panic of 1893, and nobody was buying fruit, and he would have taken any job. There was a story that I read that Mr. Hart, or Captain Hart, has accepted a job transporting bedroom furniture from Philadelphia to Jamaica. And the the value of the furniture is $163. So I don't know how much they were paying him, but anyway, but yeah, then I think, to carry that further, I think once he got into it and he saw the difference he was making, and the Cubans were very, very good about nurturing Hart and telling him, okay, here's what happened, here's what your weapons did. So I think he kind of went from being a patriotic or being a profiteer to more of a patriot, and that's the way the newspapers were portraying him all the way up until the time that he was out of jail. But the point I didn't mention is that Hart, you don't hear anything about Hart. He's not in the newspapers or in the history books, because when he was trying to find his next calling or his next job, he was in Philadelphia. He was walking up the Delaware piers near where his office was, and he tripped and fell. The coroner said he had a stroke, and he hit his head on the concrete, and he died at 39 in 1900. And so there was no more John D. Hart. Next.
Next question?
I just have to mention the book, The Fish That Ate the Whale, about another banana king. So since you lived in New Orleans.
Sam Zamuri.
Right. Since you lived in New Orleans, I thought you could compare the two and also mention Cuba today.
Yeah, the Zamuri book was a lot more successful than mine so far. But I'm waiting for the movie. I really am. I've been to Cuba twice in 2017 and 2020. And in fact, we were coming back when the COVID thing hit, and they canceled the baseball season, they canceled the Final Four, they canceled the basketball season, and we didn't know if we were going to get back. But we got to Miami Airport, and there was nobody there. Thank goodness, because anyway. But the Cuban people, it's such a shame that over the years they just have really been fighting a revolution forever. You know, they went through the Batista years. The peasants were at the mercy of the Batistas, the rich people. Castro came in, and they have just continued to slide. I asked one of the people I was with, I said, what's the average salary? What do you make a month? He said, oh, if we work hard, we can make about $8 a month. And so, and the people that, you go through the countryside, there's livestock, but they haven't eaten in months, it looked like. Just bare bones. It's a very sad situation, and I don't know what the solution is. But it's a very sad situation, and I hope and pray that at some point things change. And it doesn't look like it's going to now with Venezuela out of the mix, because they were very supportive of Cuba.
Other questions? Going once?
Going once.
Going twice?
Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much to John Miller. John's book, King of the Gunrunners, is on sale in our lobby. Make sure you grab it. The official book signing will be at 5 o'clock for both Cynthia Kerner's book, John Miller's, and our next author, who is Denard Dell, and he's going to teach us how to dodge a cannonball. So y'all get really excited about that. We've got just a few minutes here, so you can get up, move around, get you a little bit of water. As a reminder, if you want to be entered in a drawing to win this beautiful quilt, come and make a donation to the NLCC. Become an NLCC sustainer today. It can be $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever you can give. But support the power of storytelling in our community here in Mississippi. Thank you.
What time's the next guy? 4 o'clock?
Yep, and he's got a slideshow.
He's got a slideshow. What's it called?
Civil War, I think. Something.
Something. Ask Mary about it.
Oh, I did. Retelling the
Click there and put it on charge.
My guess would be that it's up there unless he put it in his pocket. I have that bag, but I have it in brown. It's got the little bow on it. It's so cute.
Every time someone comes to see it, I would say, oh, thank you, it was a gift from my mom.
Aw.
Because it is.
It is.
It's me every day.
Fantastic.
Is this your first book? This is my first novel. This is my second. My first book was a short story. A lot of fun. It was still satire. It wasn't a history thing. Also, this is interesting territory. I think. Feel encouraged. And
Or is that? It's the perfect And so it's just